With that being said, let's get started with this Creative Styles Live webinar. All right, so the first one we're going to start with is making your camera levitate with layers. So inside of the edit module here, I've just navigated to where I have those practice files downloaded to. And if you're following along in the ebook, I do have my ebook open here. I don't know if you guys can see that other side of the screen. But if you do have your ebook open, just open it to chapter 2. Yep, chapter 2. Let's find chapter 2 here. All right, and this is a super fun edit to do, and is actually a pretty easy edit to do and pretty easy to accomplish if you want to do something like this on your own with your own camera. So the first page in the first chapter, or the second chapter rather, talks about how you can actually get the camera shot so you can actually mask out the background and how you can achieve that hand photo. It has all the camera settings and what cameras I use, so check that out if you do want to make that photo on your own. But we're going to move on to the second page, which is the first step, which is matching the look of our layers. So what we need to do here is we need to go into Photo Raw, and we need to go into that folder for our camera levitation chapter. So we'll click on this folder. And in that folder, there should be 3 pictures. There should be 2 of the raw, or not raw, but 2 of the base image files. These aren't raw, they're JPEGs. And then the levitate final for an example photo. And if you don't have the example photo, not a big deal. It shows it in the ebook. But we're just going to grab these 2 photos, our camera photo and our hand photo, and we're going to head into the edit module. Now, one thing to keep in mind whenever you're taking layers into the edit module, if you're taking more than one, is whatever layer you select first, that's going to determine your canvas size. So because we're actually going to mask this layer out, we're going to mask away the background and place this camera on the hand. We probably want our hand photo as the canvas size. So we'll click that first, so it's blue. That means it's super selected. And then we'll hold down Shift, and we'll click on the camera photo. And then to bring these 2 photos into the edit module as layers, we're just going to click Layers. And that will bring them into the edit module as separate individual layers. And the first thing we need to do here is we actually need to modify that hand JPEG a little bit, kind of bring out the exposure and remove some of that blue color cast. But first things first, we're going to actually just disable this camera layer. So just click on this little button here to disable that layer. And then we'll make sure that we have our hand layer selected. So I know I do it all the time where I have 2 separate layers here, and I click on this one to hide it, and then I go to modify, my separate layer, and then it's modifying the layer that's hidden. I do it all the time, no worries. Just make sure you have the correct layer selected that you want to modify. And the first thing we're going to do this hand layer is we're actually just going to pull up the exposure a little bit. So the first step says increase the exposure slider to 0.6. This is going to brighten the photo up to match our camera layer. So you can see that by pulling up on this exposure here, it's just brightening everything up. We're just kind of making everything a little bit more even, so we have a little bit more room to work with. If we had an entirely dark shot and we just placed a bright camera onto it, it might not look as natural. So we're just kind of prepping this, kind of our foundational shot, if you will, for the composite. And so the second step is increase midtones and shadow sliders to 15. So this is the step where we're actually kind of boosting the specific tones in our shot. So we're going to be pulling up on the shadow tones, those darker tones, and then we're pulling up on the midtones, which are the skin tones, and then all those grays in that hoodie. So if we pull up on both of those sliders to 15, and you don't have to be too exact. You can pull up, 15 to 20. It doesn't have to be incredibly exact. You can always kind of modify it to your liking. And then we'll pull up on those shadow slider to about 16 as well. That looks fine like that. But now that we've pulled up on these brightening sliders, our exposure, our midtones, and our shadows, we're going to be removing contrast from the entire scene. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, yeah, we've brightened everything up, but we've also lost all of that detail. So to make our image less flat, we got to bring in contrast. So we're going to head up to our contrast slider, and it says, bring back contrast by increasing your contrast slider to 15. So we'll just bring that up to 15. Perfect. And the next step, increase the temperature slider to 70. So if we take a look at this shot and then we actually turn on our camera JPEG layer, our JPEG layer, or our camera layer, is a lot more warm than this layer. So to kind of match those colors, we're just gonna make sure we have our hand layer selected, and then we're gonna head down to our color here, and we're just gonna warm it up quite a bit. So we'll just grab our temperature slider, and to sort of match that warm look of our camera, we're just bringing up that color temperature. And also, I mean, just besides matching that look, there was a huge color cast on that portrait. So this just looks a lot more natural anyway, and not so blue. And I think that looks pretty good as far as the base image goes. So let's just hit the backslash key on our keyboard again. And that's our base photograph. And that's our modified photograph. So now we'll head on to the next step here, which is modifying the camera layer. So to modify the camera layer, we obviously have to see it. So we'll just go over to our layers pane, turn it on. And again, make sure that it's selected because you're going to be modifying a separate layer if you don't make sure that it's selected. And first things first, we're just going to go down into our tone and color, and we're going to do sort of a similar edit, but we're actually going to be removing some of the tones from the camera. And the reason we want to do that is because if we turn this layer off, this shot was taken outside on an overcast day. So everything's pretty evenly lit, evenly exposed. I really love overcast lighting for that kind of evenly lit look. There's a little bit of sun right here, but if we take a look at this shot, this was shot in the studio. Pretty soft light. It wasn't really harshly lit, but anytime you're shooting in a studio compared to an overcastly lit day, it's going to be a little bit different lighting. So this has a little bit more contrast in it compared to this photo. So we're just going to dim this down a little bit and remove some of the contrast so that it's not so different looking than this photo. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove exposure, and that's just going to remove some of the harsh contrast by dimming it down a bit. You can't have a ton of it, or you can't have a ton of contrast if you have a really dim photo. So we're just going to pull this back to about -6, right about there. And that's going to darken the camera layer to better match the moodier base photo. And then 2, decrease the contrast slider to -15. So again, we're just removing that contrast from our shot so it blends in better with the base image. So we'll just remove that from 0 to 15. And you could pull it back even a little more, maybe to like 21. That looks pretty good right there. And then increase our midtones. And then the next step is decrease our whites. So we're basically just, again, trying to remove the contrast. We're just kind of trying to make this more of a flat image so that it works well with that overcast day shot. So we'll go over here and we'll increase our midtones to 25. Right there is about fine, doesn't really matter. And then it says decrease the whites to -50. So that's just going to remove those harsh whites in the shot, and again, just eliminate some of the contrast. Just like that. And then we need to do one last thing. So if we turn this off and on, this photograph looks a little bit too warm again. So we can go down to our temperature, and we can just pull it back to about -30 or so, maybe even -25. And now that bluish color tint matches this hand photo a lot better. And so now we don't have a warm photo being placed on top of a cool photo or vice versa. It's just kind of trying to keep everything consistent and cohesive. All right, so now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, it's a very subtle look, but see how it just kind of flattens everything out and just removes those harsh contrasts? Just very mellow edit to the camera layer. All right, so now we can move on to the next step here, which is masking away the camera's background. And what we're going to do to mask away the camera's background is we're going to use the AI Quick Mask tool. And the AI Quick Mask tool is a really, really incredible tool for situations like this. It makes masking so easy. So all we're going to do here is I'm just going to click on this camera layer, and I'm going to hit Z on my keyboard so I can zoom in. And then I'm going to click 50 here. So now I'm at about 50% there. Actually, let's just do 25. We'll fit it. Come on, zoom. There we go. We'll zoom to about 33 looked good. There we go. Come on, 33. Sweet. Okay, we're at 33. I'm going to leave it there. And this is just a zoom in, so I have a little bit more working space in there, and I can kind of get the brush in there if I need to. All right, so to grab the AI Quick Mask tool, you can do it by heading over to your masking tools over here on the left side of PhotoRaw, or you can just hit W on your keyboard. And with the AI Quick Mask tool, it's really easy to use. The first thing you do is you make sure you have this mode area determined. So whatever mode you use, for example, drop, when we paint on our drop mode, this is going to determine all the areas that we want to remove from this photograph, all the areas that we want to be masked out. And then our mode keep, these are all the areas that we want to keep on the photograph, the ones that are protected from the mask. So we'll start with our drop mode first. And I typically have a pretty big brush size, especially if I'm masking out kind of a background, especially, you know, this large tonal gray. We could realistically just make it as big as it goes. And then I'm just going to brush this on because I'm removing in red all of that large tonal background. And one thing that I would recommend when you are using the AI Quick Mask tool is to use a couple brush strokes at a time and not just try to paint on the entire thing at once, because if you do mess up, then you're going to hit Control-Z and it's going to take you out of the AI Quick Mask tool, or it's going to remove all of the progress you made on that brush. So just try to brush in a couple brush strokes at a time, and it'll make it easier later on. So I'm just kind of making sure I'm painting over all the areas that I want to remove, but I'm not being too picky. You know, we can always go in and brush these areas out, and we're going to be zooming out from this in a second. So you don't have to be too specific on the edges of your mask, just to make sure it looks realistic and believable. All right, so that looks pretty good for our red. Now we need to switch our mode, which we can do by going up to this mode menu, or you can just hold down Shift and hit X on your keyboard. And that's the same for any mode with any brush or any tool. So for example, the chisel mask tool, you can hold down Shift, hit X, and it will change the mode. All right, so now we're with the keep mode, which is going to be painting on our shot in green. So same thing, I'm just gonna brush this on, use a couple brush strokes at a time. Just like that. You don't have to get too specific on the edges, but you know, obviously the closer you get, the better it's going to turn out. And you can always refine after you apply this, so you don't have to be stuck to that one AI mask. And typically that dial right there, this dial right here, does kind of get away from me on the mask sometimes. So just make sure you have that selected right there with green. We can always fix it if it doesn't show up in a second, but okay, perfect. I mean, that's pretty overkill, but just to give you an example of, I mean, it's not also detailed, but it just, as much as you can paint on, the better. And so I'm just gonna click apply. This is going to build the mask for me. And voila, I think it looks pretty good. We have this little area right there. So I'll just make this right there, paint a couple little green spots like that. And then I don't see any other ones. Cool, we'll click apply again. That should fix that little area right there. Sweet, okay. So now we'll go up to done. This is going to refine the mask and take away the background. And it's pretty instantly satisfying right here when it takes it away. Boom, it's kind of like it just levitated in their hand. But now what we can do is we just need to refine the edges a little bit. So we zoom in here. I'm going to zoom into 50 now. So if we zoom in here, the edges aren't too bad. I mean, there's a little bit of haloing right here and right there and some kind of ghost edges. But what we can do is use our masking brush at first. We're just going to hit B on our keyboard. That's going to grab me my masking brush. And I'm going to make sure that I'm actually going to go up to my feathering, and I'm going to make sure that it's set to about 50. And the reason that I set this to 50 is so that it's a little harder of a brush edge, so I can kind of get in a little bit more detailed into the edges and paint away the extruding objects. And then I make my brush size quite small, about this size, and then we can just go in here and just paint that out. Just like that. And then I'll probably that looks pretty good. And then we'll paint this guy out, paint that out. Perfect. Okay, so now one last thing we can do to just kind of shear up the edges real quick is we're gonna use our chisel mask tool. So we're gonna head into our refine tools and we're gonna go up to our chisel mask tool. And the chisel mask tool is an awesome tool because it literally sees the edges of your mask. So it's gonna see this camera and it's just gonna take away and chisel away at the edges around it. And it's not gonna do anything inside of that mask. It's not gonna do anything outside of it. It's just literally gonna chisel away at the mask. So it's great for edges like this. And one thing that people may not know is that if you double click this chisel mask tool, it's going to clear the mask around the entire photograph so you actually don't have to paint it around the entire edge. So I'll turn it up quite high so we can see it. I'll turn it up to about 30. But now watch, keep your eye on the camera and I'll double click the chisel mask tool. See how it just removed a little bit of that edge? Actually, that worked out great. I think that looks really good now. So yeah, 28 is a good number to use for that chisel mask tool. And again, if you want to change the mode, let's say you took out too much, you can hold down Shift and hit X, and that will change the mode to add. And then you can add that back in by double clicking, or you can hit Control Z, whatever works best for you. All right, moving on from the chisel mask tool. We need to go and zoom out. Oops. So that looks pretty neat just like that. It's looking decent. If we turn this off and on, the edges, I think, look pretty good. There's not any really haloing or strong haloing on them. So I think we're on the right path right now. We can go to the ebook here, and we basically did masking. We did step 3 already. So we'll go back down, and then we did the optional. We masked away a little bit of the edge. I wish I would have put that chisel mask tool tip in there, but that's why you guys are watching. That's another tip for when you're masking around or messing around with layers. All right, so the positioning, this page, when I was writing the ebook, I really was having trouble on where to position and what the camera size should be like. So what I decided to do was just leave it how it looked. I thought it looked perfect kind of how it was, and all I did was move the camera up a little bit. So if you want to actually manipulate the size of the camera, you definitely can. You could make it a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger. For the sake of just the book, I'm gonna leave it how it is for right now. But what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna hit V on my keyboard. That'll grab me my transform tool. That'll allow me to move this layer around. And all I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna move it up maybe just kind of above that elbow line right there, maybe even a little bit below. So then it just seems it's a little more in the air, almost like it's at the peak throw of her levitating in her hand. I think it just looks a little bit more natural like that. So we'll just click apply and boom. So now we've basically created the levitation photograph. Now all we have to do is make it a little bit more realistic and stylize it with different filters and effects. So before I do that, let me just hit up the Q&A and see if there's any questions. So no questions about the edit so far. If you do have any questions while I'm going through here, if I'm doing something a little bit too fast or I need to explain something a little bit more in depthly, let me know. All right, so now what we need to do, we'll go into the ebook again, and now we're on merging and styling. So we're on step 5. All right, so let's create a composite layer and stylize. So to create a composite layer, all you have to do is, there's a few different ways you can do it. My recommended way is to create a new stamped layer. So a new stamped layer basically takes whatever layers you have in the layers pane, it duplicates them, and then it merges them into one cohesive composite layer. So if you have 4 different layers here, it's going to duplicate these 4 layers, and then it's going to into a composite layer that you can mess with and modify, but you still have your 4 separate layers that you can go back and play with as well. So easiest way to do it, or maybe the only way to do it, right click and then click new stamped layer. And it's going to, again, duplicate these 2 layers, the camera and the hand layer, and then it's going to merge them together. Pretty big raw file, or pretty big hand JPEG file. I think it was shot on the new Sony, so. Sweet, okay. So now what we can do is we'll just double click that composite layer, or new stamped layer, and we'll just name it final, or merged, or together, whatever you want to name it, not a big deal. Just to stay a little bit organized. And so now we can go in here and we're going to start modifying this photo by using some different effects and filters. All right, so the first effect we're going to want to add, we're just going to bring in some quick style to our shot. And another way you could achieve this is by using your tone curve, but I use the tone curve on so many webinars and so many videos that I'm going to stay away from it, or try to stay away from it in this webinar. So we're just going to go into the effects tab here. I'm going to add a filter, and I'm going to add one of my other all-time favorite filters, the LUTs filter. So the LUTs filter, I really like the LUTs filter with composites like this because it allows you to just bring on a style really quickly and easily. You don't have to really mess with any sliders or anything like that. So one of my favorites here is this Braniff. I think it's Braniff. Is it Bernag? It might be Bernag, and I've been pronouncing it wrong this entire time. Hopefully it's not Bernag. It's probably Bernag. Okay, I'm going to click Bernag. That actually looks pretty good. When I was playing with it and writing the book, I did actually play with the opacity a little bit, and I did lower the contrast. But play with it how you want to do it, and also you could use many other LUTs. We'll reset this, and a lot of these that look good, or a couple of my favorites on photos like this, are Comfort. Comfort's a really good one. Comfort, Classic, Bernag, and then Thorough. Thorough's a really good one as well. So Comfort, Classic, Bernag, and Thorough, all really great LUTs that don't add tons and tons of style into your shot. So if we click on Thorough and turn this off and on, you know, nothing too crazy, just kind of a moody, faded black look a little bit, and then some harsher contrast. So those are some good ones. I'm just gonna click Bernag again, or Bernaf, whatever it is, and we'll leave it at its default state. And then we have the next step, which is adding a sun flare. Sweet. So the sun flare, when I was writing this edit, I couldn't figure out how to make things look believable and realistic. I was just kind of stuck here with this, and I was like, how do I make this look, you know, a little bit different, a little more alive? It just looks so flat. And I was like, oh, well, if I add a sun flare, I could actually make it look like it's a little bit backlit, and it gives it a lot more depth in the scene. So we're going to add a filter, and we're going to add the sun flare filter. So with this sun flare filter, I'm actually going to go up to my amount, and I'm going to raise it to, is that what I do? Sorry, no, I don't do that. I'm going to reset this. I'm getting ahead of myself for another edit. Okay, so add a filter and add the sun flare filter. Inside the filter, go into the texture menu and choose sun flare 2. Oh, so we're going to choose a bigger, bolder sun flare. Okay, so inside of the sun flare filter, sorry guys, we're going to choose a texture, and we're going to choose sun flare 2. So with sun flare 2, it's added on the right side of your frame. So you can always swap your sun flares by just going into your sun flare filter, and then you can just click on this to flip it horizontally, and now it's on the left side. And the reason that I wanted it on the left side is because if I turn the sun flare filter off, the sun was coming through this area, and you can see it's kind of illuminating her hand, and that's where the shadows are coming from down here. So by adding the sun flare, it just brings in a little bit more light and makes it seem like there's more sun coming into the scene. Okay, so one last thing. Oh wait, this is on the top left. One last thing in the sun flare filter, go down into the sunshine area and pull up the amount to 15. So with the sun flare filters, they actually have this sunshine filter. So many suns, I know, but the sunshine filter is actually built in to the sun flare filter. So to add in that sort of emulated, high contrasty sunshine look, I can just pull up on the amount and see how that adds in more contrast to the scene. So I'm actually going to pull it up a little more than 15. That seems kind of low. So I'll just pull up to about 25. Again, any of these sliders that I'm using in those edits, please modify them to whatever you want to do. Make the shots that you want to make. These are really just guidelines. So we pulled up the amount to 24. If I turn this off and on, I really like what that does. And one thing you could do with this sun flare filter is you could actually mask out a little bit from the camera to make it seem even more backlit. So if I go to my masking options, we'll just click B on our keyboards. That'll grab me my masking brush. I'll make my brush size pretty big, and then I'll lower the feather or increase the feathering to 100. So I have my brush size or masking brush selected. Sorry, I have my masking brush selected. I'm going to increase the brush size a little bit. And now I'm going to lower the opacity of this, so I'm actually not removing so much of the filter. And then I'm just gonna, oh, maybe a little bit smaller. And then I'm just gonna kind of paint away like that. So if I turn this off and on now, see how it makes it seem like it's kind of standing out of that light a little bit, and that the light's back, or that the camera's being backlit and that it's not being lit from the front of it. So just kind of a suggestion. You don't really have to do that. It doesn't matter too much, but it does kind of help add some depth to the shot. And then one thing you could also do is to kind of dull down the harshness of her fingers, because we have kind of this soft glow now, is I'll go in here, I'll add a filter, and I'll add a light glow to the scene. But I'll lower the opacity a ton, maybe about there. And then I'll just paint this out from the camera. Oops. So if we turn this off and on, it just adds a little bit of glow. It's a little bit more soft. Just some ideas, some creative ideas. Okay, we'll turn that off and we'll go back to this. So if we turn if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, it's already looking so much better just with those two filters. So we have one last filter to add and then we're good to go. So it says add a filter and add a vignette filter. So we'll go in here, we'll add a filter, and then I'll add the vignette. And we'll choose Big Softy, because that's what it says. Yes, use the Big Softy preset and lower the opacity to 65 is what it says. So we'll choose the Big Softy, and then we'll lower the opacity to 65. And one thing I'm going to want to do, or one thing you should do most of the time with vignettes, is position the vignette. Because, I mean, obviously, when you put a vignette, it's going to be positioned on the center of the frame. But you could always position it in a different way. For example, if I click on this little icon there, now I can move this vignette around, and I can place it where it's more centered around these two instead of just centered around the camera. So now if I turn this off and on, that dims down these areas, this top area and this bottom area, but it leaves this middle area kind of nice and bright and leads the viewer's eye into the frame a bit more. All right, so if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard now, boom, we're done with the filters and everything looks nice. Looks pretty good. So all we have to do now is crop it. So I'll hit C on my keyboard. That's going to grab me my crop tool. And I'm going to head up to my preset. It's already set to it. So I'm going to choose a 4x5 preset because this was shot vertically. So it was shot portrait orientation. And if I choose my 4x5, I can easily just remove. So I'm getting ahead of myself again. I'll reset this. And so look at this top area of my photograph right there. I don't need any of that in the shot. I don't need any of this bokeh. It looks really nice, but I don't need any of that. So a quick way to remove that is just click on my 4x5 crop. And that's always going to remove, some of the top and bottom of your vertical portrait shot. So I'll just pull that down. Oops. Like that. Position it so I can see the hand and I can see the camera. And then boom. And there we go. Now we're a lot more in tune with the frame. We're a little bit closer. It's a lot more personal. Whereas if we were back, kind of back looking at the shot, it wouldn't be kind of as strong of a photograph. All right, so let me check the questions to see if there's any questions. We kind of flew through that edit, but they do kind of take a minute, don't they? So I'm just going to answer one of these questions here. All right, so Eugene's asking about the ebook. So the ebook that we are referencing is the Creative Styles ebook. You can get it on the website. Maybe just Google On One Creative Styles ebook, and it should show up. Another question is, Malcolm asks, do you have an example of masking a difficult subject such as wispy hair? So not in this webinar, we're not going to show anything too in-depthly about masking, but there is an in-depth masking webinar about 2 weeks from now, Masking Defined Part 2. And if you want to register for that, go to our website, just onone.com/webinars, and you can register for that. And that's a little bit more, or a lot more intensely about masking and advanced masks. So no questions so far with the edit. So voila, we're done with edit number 2. That's chapter 2. So we'll just go in here. I'm actually just going to delete this layer, delete this layer. Then we'll go back into browse. All right, so if we go back to polling, it looked like reviving a boring photo was the top one. And then the next one was transforming stills into fine art. So we'll do reviving a boring photo next, and then we'll do transforming stills into fine art. And transforming stills is quite a lengthy one. I think actually reviving a boring photo is a lengthy one too. So I'll try to get to both of those. Let's try to knock these two out in this webinar. And please, if you do have any questions, feel free to hit the Q&A. I'll try to get to those kind of throughout here. I know we're kind of cruising along, but got a lot to cover. Actually, let's do the fine art one first, because it's the first in the chapters. And then we can do reviving a boring photo next, because it's the next chapter. All right, so open up to chapter 4 in the ebook. And we'll start with step 1, which is converting the layers to black and white and cropping. But first, we need to take our images into PhotoRaw in the edit module. So inside PhotoRaw, I'm just in the browse module again, and I'm just going to click on the folder that's transforming still images into fine art. Sweet. So this is just an example photo. I'll just pull this to the side here. And then we have our 3 images here. So we have our birds, we have our fine art base, and then we have our fine art POV layer. So we need to first take these images into the edit module as separate individual layers. Now remember in the first, or the second chapter that we just did, that whenever you bring in multiple layers into the edit module, whatever layer you have selected first is going to determine your canvas size. So we want to select this fine art base as our base layer, and then we can select these other images after. The reason being is that we want this base layer as our canvas size. So make sure that this is blue, that it's super selected, and then hold down Shift, select those other ones, and then you can click on layers, and then we'll take these 3 layers into the edit module. Perfect. So now you can see we have this photograph as our base photo, and then it will add the other 2 on top of it. All right, so we're first going to convert this image to black and white, but we're going to go to this birds layer, and I'm just going to turn this off. Actually, I'm going to drag this birds layer above my fine art POV. Typically in this edit, you'd probably want birds, fine art POV layer, and then fine art base. It doesn't really matter until the end, but just to stay a little organized, I'm going to do that right now. And then I'm going to turn this birds layer off. So I'm just going to turn this off so we can't see it. And again, really important to make sure you have the correct layer selected. So I'm going to make sure that I have fine art POV layer selected. And then we're going to go down into our effects tab here, and we're going to convert this image to a black and white simply with a black and white filter. So we'll just click effects. I'll click add filter and black and white. Boom, voila, we're done. We don't need to do anything else at all. Good to go. So we'll hide this layer. We're going to hide this POV layer, and now we're going to start working on our base layer. And again, we're going to convert it to black and white. Make sure that that fine art base layer, that's the one that you have selected. And then we'll go down and we'll go, yeah, we got to modify the tone and color inside of the develop tab. So with our base layer, we're going to go into the develop tab, and with our camera profiles, we're going to choose on one landscape. And that's going to brighten the scene up a little bit and add in just a little bit of tonal contrast kind of in this foreground area. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboards, just brightens up the overall scene and makes it look a lot less flat. And then I think we're going to use AI Auto. Yeah, so to develop the image, we're just going to click AI Auto. And voila, that's just going to kind of add in some contrast, modify some highlights and mid-tone sliders, and really just set the foundational look. But because if we turn on this photograph, it's a lot darker than this one. So let's lower the exposure on our fine art base to I'm just going to lower it to about 0.25. That looks pretty good. Actually, I'll leave it. I don't know why I was thinking I didn't do it. Lower the exposure. I'm sorry, guys. We actually don't need to lower the exposure. There's too many edits. I've been kind of looking at the ebook, and there's so many edits, and I've been going through kind of practicing them in Photo Raw in my head. So I'm sorry if I get ahead of myself with different edits. We actually don't need to modify the exposure. We're good with AI Auto. So we'll just leave AI Auto. And now we need to convert this image to a black and white. So I'll go into the Effects tab. I'll add a filter, and we'll add black and white. But to match that sort of grungy, moody contrast in the POV layer here, we're going to go to More, and we're going to choose Fade to Black and White. Oh, no, we're going to choose Deep Blacks. Okay, so Deep Blacks. Boom, just like that. So now we have a lot more rich of contrast in our scene. So if we turn this off and on now, is that Deep Blacks? Yeah. So now if we turn this off and on, looks a lot more cohesive to the other photograph, and they're going to blend a lot more naturally together. All right. So now I'm going to go down here, and the next step is to crop it. So basically, we're cropping this photo so that we can remove this left and top area of our scene, and it will fit a lot better with this POV layer. So I'm just going to hit C on my keyboard, and I'm actually going to go up to Freeform. I'm going to reset this. And all I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to pull this down, this corner down, like that. Maybe put a little bit of this on the sky. What are we at? 3.7. So is that 37? I'm just kind of copying the crop that I had in the ebook, and it says about 3751 by 2500. So just about there. Perfect. Now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up on it a little bit, and I'm going to pull over. Maybe I won't pull up. I'm going to pull down. Okay, right about there. So I'm basically just trying to position these two, or these three boats on the middle of that left rule of thirds. So once you have it about right there, again, if you have the ebook open, it has that crop ratio in there. Should be easy to just kind of copy that, and then I'll hit apply. And perfect. Now we have a cropped photo. And the reason we're doing this is, again, is just to make sure that this fine art POV layer fits nicely on that horizon line. And it'll make a lot more sense in just a second. And we'll skip to the next step, which is positioning the POV layer. So what we're going to do is we're going to head over to our layers pane here. We're going to enable that POV layer like that. I'm going to click on it to make sure that it's enabled. And I'm actually going to click V, and I'm going to just click on this little button with the 4 arrows in the square, and that's going to fit it to canvas like that. So now I've fit this layer to canvas. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my opacity. I'm going to lower the opacity until I can see the bottom image. And here's the important part. We're going to drag this image up, or down, rather down, sorry. And we're basically aligning this horizon line right here. You can see that top horizon line. We're aligning that with this bottom horizon line. So we're going to have to rotate in a second, but just align it at first, about right there. And then we'll grab a corner. I'll move it over a little bit. And then we'll just rotate a little bit. Why rotate it? Oh, I hate using this rotate tool. Okay, we'll just leave that. That's fine. Maybe a little bit more. Okay, that looks fine just like that. We'll just leave it right there. And then I'm just going to overlap it a little bit. You might be able to see it, but it's not a huge deal. I mean, it's fine art. Okay. All right. So we're just going to click apply. We'll apply that. Now we'll raise this back to 100. And now we need to, so we position the layer. We're good to go there. So now we'll go to step 3, which is blending the scene together. So now we're going to use the blending mode to blend these two photographs together and make it look a lot more natural. So I'm going to go over to my layer here. I'm going to click on the layer that says POV layer. And in my blending options, I'm going to go down to multiply. So already we can see that that's really blended these two layers together pretty much perfectly. And it looks like we're kind of standing on the edge of this boat, and now we're looking out onto the sea. And one thing I want to do here, just before we do anything, is let's just crop this real quick. So I'm just going to pull in on this to remove that excess, just real quickly. Just like that. So I'm just going to remove the excess right away before we start modifying anything else. There we go. So now we have a clean slate and everything looks a lot better. But if we turn this layer off and on, I mean, instantly adds such a cool factor into this. I mean, that's an awesome photo, but really does bring a lot more into just sort of a simple ocean shot. All right, so what we need to do now is we can actually remove some of this top, or it's rather the bottom layer that's being revealed, but we can remove some of this bottom layer from our boat by just hitting B on our keyboard. I'm going to lower my brush size a little bit, and then I'll go to my opacity. I'll make sure that it's at 100. And then we're going to make sure that we have fine art base selected. So we're going to be masking out our base layer. So make sure you have base selected. And then we're just going to, we got to make sure our masking options are selected for the base. So if you're trying to mask out that layer, make sure your masking options are selected, or it will start painting out your filter. And then we'll just brush away that texture. And that looks already so much better. And you could be, you know, as specific as you want. I'm not being too crazy with it, but. And then we'll remove it from, did we remove it from this thing? No. Okay, and we'll just leave it on that boat right there. It looks pretty good like that. Sweet. So we've removed that from the bottom. That looks perfectly fine just like that. And then the next step is, brushing away the bottom layer to reveal the top layer. So we've done that. So now what we need to do is remove the background from the birds and position the birds. All right, so we need to go back up to our layers, and we need to go to our birds layer here, and we'll select it to enable it. And now we can see the birds. And I'm gonna make sure I have V selected on my keyboard, and then I'm just gonna make sure this is fit to canvas, just like that. And so I can see it a little bit better. All right, so the way that we need to remove this background from these birds, I'm gonna make these a lot smaller. The way that we're going to remove the background from these birds is we're actually going to use a color range mask. So, are we using a color range mask? I'm so sorry, guys. I keep thinking we're on a different edit. No, we're using a color range mask. It's in this chapter. All right. So for this birds layer here, I'm just going to click on the masking options, and now I'm going to go into my color range. I'm going to click that to enable it, and that's going to mask out a little bit of it already. But we're going to click on this little box, which is our colors, and then we're going to choose white. So now this is masking out all of the areas, or all of the areas in white are being revealed, but we need to invert this so that we only see the black birds. So we'll just go up to invert. And now we can kind of play with our color range to remove some of that white edge around the birds. So I'm just going to hit V on my keyboard. I'll move these a little bit so you can see them a bit better. But already, I mean, just instantly remove that background from them just by using a color range mask. So a color range mask, awesome tool for creating sort of PNGs on your images in Photo Raw just by using layers. All right, so now we move this. Okay, so now we're just gonna make these a little bit smaller here. I'm gonna lower the scale. Maybe a bit bigger. What do you guys think? Does that look pretty good? Maybe a little bit bigger. I think I was having troubles with this when I was writing the book too. I couldn't figure out which size to make them. It's tough, you know? You never know. You want to make it look realistic. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. One thing I usually do with birds like this is I'll go over to my opacity, and these birds may not need it, but sometimes when you have birds, especially birds like that where they're black and silhouetted, if you have them in a sky, for example, a white sky like this, they may look a little bit too strong and not natural because they're so black and contrasted. So what you can do to fix that is just lower the opacity a little bit, and that'll kind of blend them in with the scene a little bit more and make them not so strong and relevant in the frame. And we can actually lower the opacity for these. That looks pretty good when they're lowered. Sweet. So now what do we do? Sweet, so now we actually go in and we create that fine art look. So to do that, we're gonna again create a new stamped layer. So inside of our layers pane here, I'm just gonna right click and I'll create a new stamped layer. And again, this is just gonna take these 3 layers here. So we have 3 layers. It's gonna duplicate them. So we have another 3 layers, and then it's gonna merge them together. So we have this layer and then these 3 layers here. And then we can play with that duplicated layer, that composite layer, but then we also have the ability to play with all of those other layers as well. And then I'll just rename this composite or something to stay organized. All right. So what are we doing to our photo to make it a fine art look? I don't want to keep messing up and giving you guys wrong steps. All right, so we're going to go into the Develop tab for the final layer, and inside Tone and Color, we're going to choose AI Auto. So in the Develop tab, we'll click AI Auto. Right on. It's just going to brighten up the photo a little bit and make it a little more natural looking. And now we need to bring in some nice texture to the scene. So we'll go into the Effects tab here. I'm going to choose a filter, and I'll choose Textures. And a really nice texture for fine art is this grunge texture. Love it. Isn't that just amazing? It just adds sort of that fine art, old vintage camera style to the photograph. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to go and we're going to bring in a little bit of warmth to the photograph. And an easy way to bring in warmth to your shot is by using a photo filter. So we're going to click on Photo Filter, and we're going to choose this 85. And it's not incredibly strong. I really like what that does. It almost just brings in a little bit more vintage vibe to the shot, kind of that sepia look on black and whites. And then the next thing we're going to do I modify anything in the 85 preset style? No. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a filter, and we're going to add the curves filter. And I know I said I wasn't going to use the curves filter, but it's in the book, so I have to use it. So we're going to add a filter. We'll add the curves filter. And it looks like we're basically just going to bring up the midtones and then control our shadow tones. So the curves filter is one of my all-time favorite tools. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal tool for your photographs. And I like to think of the curves filter as sort of the EQ. If you like music, I like to think of the curves filter as sort of the EQ for your photographs. It allows you to take, your shadows, which, your base, and then your midtones, which are your mids, and then your highlights and your highs, and you can modify, all of those separate tones really easily and do whatever you want to those individual tones. So it really just allows you to play with the photograph and really achieve looks kind of in a really fast and practical way. I can't talk about the tone curve enough. It's a really awesome filter, really fun to play with. But anyway, so for the tone curve, we're just gonna click in here in our midtones, and I'm gonna drag this up a little bit, like that. It says drag it up about 2. And so you can see already that that's just boosting these midtones, these middle grays in our frame, and already it's livened up the shot. And I think the birds look fine. We can leave the birds. Maybe I shouldn't lower the opacity so much on the birds, because now they look a little bit too unnoticeable, but they don't look too bad. They'll be okay. All right, so now we're gonna go down to our tone curve here. Now that we've raised our midtones, we've brightened the shot up. So by brightening our shot up, we've lost some of the contrast. So to bring some of that contrast back in, we're gonna lower our shadow tones. So now our curve's like this, and then we're gonna lower the shadow tones, and that's gonna bring in contrast. So if I grab this is my shadow tones, watch as I pull this down, and that'll incorporate that contrast back into the frame. Just like that. So now we have that rich, contrasty look along with that midtone boost. It's almost like, that was almost like a sunshine filter added onto the frame. All right, so I think that might be the last step. Yeah, all right. And in the example, it does look like the bird's a little bit darker, so I could have easily not modified the opacity, but they look fine. So now if we go over to our layers here, and I'm just gonna turn off these two layers, and I'm gonna reset this fine art base. And now watch as I turn off this composite layer and our fine art layer. So from this photo, we've made this photo. In not a lot of time. That was quicker than the first edit. So, and boring photo. And I feel bad saying that this is a boring photo. It's not a boring image. It's just, you know, there's just not much going on. You could kind of add a little bit to it. Why does that keep going over there? Okay. All right. So first things first, we need to take this photo into the edit module here. And then we're gonna modify it a little bit inside our tone and color pane. So it says, inside tone and color, select AI match to develop our photo settings automatically. So all we're gonna do is we're just gonna basically set our base look by using AI auto. And then once we click AI auto, we're actually gonna remove some of the exposure because it's a little bit too bright, and we'll remove the exposure by about half a stop. So now we were here, now we're here. Nothing too crazy, just basically added in you know, a little bit more white to the scene, and then we added that lens correction. So nothing too crazy on the shot. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go up to our camera profile, and it says add the on-one landscape profile. And what the on-one landscape profile typically does is it brightens up a little bit of the scene and also adds in some contrast. So we'll click on-one landscape. And already, if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, that looks like such a better image. And all we did was we hit AI auto and then we clicked on-one landscape. So for setting your base look on shots like this with overcast shots, I really, really like that on-one landscape camera profile. Okay, so now we need to move on. And we're gonna crop the shot a little bit. So I'm just gonna see on my keyboard, that'll grab me my crop tool, and kind of similar to that hand edit, or the camera levitating edit rather, I'm gonna go up to my menu and I'm gonna choose 4x5. And then I'll just pull this down, pull that in a little bit. Perfect. Just like that. So now we have our cropped boring photo. Again, not boring, just not a whole lot going on. And the first thing we need to do after cropping is we need to bring in that weather. So whenever I have a photo like this where there's these overcasts, all this overcast lighting, everything's evenly exposed, adding in weather, especially when there's weather in the shot, so we actually have snow, adding in weather can bring a lot to your shot. So if we go to effects and we add a filter, let's add the weather filter. And we're gonna choose texture accumulation. So already it looks believable, like it is actually snowing outside, but we're gonna make it look a lot more natural. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go and we're gonna lower the opacity of the snow to 45. And that's gonna make it not so strong on the shot. And then, sorry guys, I'm trying not to get ahead of myself with these edits so I don't give you guys the wrong information. Okay, so now we just need to basically add in some fog. So with the weather filter, it has this fog section already built into it. So if you do want to add in fog, maybe do a scene like this where we could literally just bring in fog to the top of the frame, it's a really good idea. And it kind of dims down this area and makes the scene look even more weathered. So I'll go down to my fog here. It's on top half slow, so I'll leave that there. And then I'll just pull it up to 45. Wait. Yep, pull up on the fog to 45. So just like that. And now if we turn this off and on, that looks a lot more natural like that. I really like how that looks like that. Sweet. So now we'll go to the next step here. So we need to mask out a portion of the snow texture from the sky to blend in later. Make sure you have the weather filter selected and grab the masking bug by hitting M on your keyboard. So we're just gonna make sure we have our weather filter selected. We're gonna hit M on our keyboards. And now we need to put down a gradient here so that we remove the top layer of snow from our sky. So I'll just drop this down here. Actually, I'm gonna choose my linear preset and choose, yep, linear top. So I'll just drop this down and I'll move it kind of right in the middle of the frame. And then I'm just gonna go up to my masking options here. And I'm gonna go down to my density and I'm gonna lower the density a little bit. And that's just gonna bring a little bit of that snow and that fog back up to the top of my shot. So how low do... Oh, I need to lower the opacity of the mask. Sorry, guys. So I'm gonna lower the opacity of this mask, and that's going to, I mean, it's gonna do the same thing. But I'm lowering the opacity of the mask to 45. And that's just bringing back some of that snow layer onto the sky, just like that. So now if we turn this off and on, it's a lot more natural looking now. All right, so now we'll move on to the next step here, and this is painting light to add depth. I feel like I missed this step. Huh, maybe not. But one thing I'm gonna do here just before we start going, I'm actually gonna lower the exposure. I'm sorry, guys. I'm gonna lower this exposure to -1, like that. And now what we need to do is we need to go to the step where we actually paint in light. So painting light to add depth. So all we're gonna do here is we're just gonna paint in light with local adjustments, and that's gonna bring in light where we want the viewers to look. So we'll click on our local tab here. What's this weather doing? I'm gonna reset this weather. Okay, that looks better. Okay, so local adjustments tab here. And now we're gonna make sure we have this local adjustment and it's set to lighten. So we'll click lighten, that makes sure our exposure is set to 1. And now we have our adjustment brush selected. And all we're gonna do is just paint on this little pathway. Actually, I'm gonna try to avoid this van. But you're just wanting to paint on this little pathway right here. And that's gonna bring the viewer's attention into this area and kind of lead them into the frame. Like that. Perfect. Now we'll go down here. And so now we need to add mood and stylize inside of effects. So we need to convert the image to black and white right off the bat. All right, so we'll go into our effects tab. We'll add a filter and we'll add black and white. And with this black and white, this is when we're gonna actually choose our fade to black and white style. So we'll go to our more presets and we're gonna add this fade to black and white, and that's gonna bring sort of a moodier, vintagey black and white look under the shot. Just like that. So now if I turn this off and on, really adds a moody black and white look to the photograph. All right, so now inside of our black and white preset, we're just gonna go down into our tone area and we're gonna pull back on the brightness to 0 or to -100. So we can see now that that's bringing on some of that or showing us that light that we painted on earlier. And we can always go back and modify that light. So if I want to paint on maybe a little bit more onto this, there we go. Maybe just a little bit of light onto the camper. That looks nice like that. Perfect. So now if we go back into effects, see how now this light is really, really popping out of the frame because we've lowered all that brightness. So now what we can do to kind of revive the flat grays in the shot is we're going to add a curves filter. And the curves filter, again, is just perfect for pulling up on midtones or specific tones in your image. So we'll add the filter, and we'll add curves. And then I'm just going to click and drag in this middle tone area, and I'll just pull it up about 1 or 2, maybe about there. And then on this left-hand side, this bottom left point, that's my black point. So if I want to add in a faded matte look, I could pull this directly up, and that's going to add in a fade to my shot. So I'll just pull that up about halfway, like that. And now I'm going to incorporate contrast back into my scene because I pulled up all of the contrast using the midtones and the black point. So by pulling up on these 2 points right here, this left and this middle point, that's lost some of the contrast. So to bring back that contrast, I'm going to go into my shadow tones, and I'm going to pull down on them actually quite a bit. What does it look like? Maybe not that much. Well, let's do it right here, and then I'll go to my develop, and I'll actually lower the, or increase the exposure a little bit more. Oh, no. Oops. Come on. Delete. Delete. Okay. So I definitely don't want that as strong as it is. Probably about right there. That looks probably fine. You don't gotta do anything too crazy to it. It's still not looking. I'm just gonna try another curves filter. Pull up on a little bit. Add a little fade. We'll just do that. That looks fine like that. And I'm actually gonna go back and lower that exposure again. Perfect. All right. So now what we need to do is we're just gonna add in a vignette filter. So we'll go to effects, we'll add a filter, we'll add a vignette. I'll choose Big Softy. This is gonna create a vignette around the scene and really, really accentuate that light in the middle of our frame. And then we're gonna pull up on our brightness slider, the -65, so it's not so intensely strong. And then let's just click on this little icon here, and then we'll just drag it kind of right in the center of the light, like that. And that just dims down the top area, that bottom area, and really just kind of accentuates the painted light in the frame. All right, so now there's a few different effects that we go through here and add, and the first 2 are textures. So let's add a filter. We'll add the textures filter, and we're gonna add grunge vignette light. So we'll go into our more styles here, and we're gonna go up to grunge vignette light. And the reason I want grunge vignette light is because it's basically creating that grunge look like we used in the fine art, but it's vignetting it around the frame. So if I turn this off and on, see how that kind of dulls down these areas up top and doesn't make them so prominent? And so we're not really looking up here like, oh, is this snow believable? We're really just kind of looking in here at the textures because it's forcing our viewer into the areas of light. So I think that looks pretty good as far as that texture goes. Let's add another texture. And we're gonna use our recycled paper. So we'll click recycled, like that. Okay, perfect. And now we're gonna go into our textures blending options, and we're gonna use a cool blend mode for adding on textures specifically to just luminance and not modifying the color. So if we look at this texture here, you can see that it's bringing on some color. Well, if we want to keep the black and white and we don't want to modify any of the color, we can use the luminosity blend mode to protect the colors in our shot. So we'll go into this gear icon here, we'll go into our modes, and we'll head down to luminosity. And now it's strictly applying that texture to the luminance, the contrast, the midtones, the shadows, but it's not applying it to any of the color saturation or hue values. So it's only applied to the contrast, midtones, and shadows so that we don't affect the black and white in the shot. Sweet. So now if I hit the \K on my keyboard, that's our original, and this is after. So way different. I really like what we've done to just kind of bring out the light in here. And you could always kind of dim some things down or modify some stuff. One thing that I would probably do in this shot is I would honestly pull back on the exposure even more. Probably about there. And then I'd go into my local adjustments tab. We'll add an adjustment. We'll add lighten. And now we're going to use a gradient mask or a shape mask to create sort of an anti-vignette. So we'll click on, or we'll hold down Shift, hit K. That's going to grab me my adjustable gradient. Then we'll go up to our shape menu and we'll choose edges. So now if we drop this down, there we go. So now if we drop this down with the edges shape, this is applying the local adjustment layer strictly into the inside of the mask, and it's protecting everywhere outside of it. So what we can do now is I'll pull this in. Pretty tight. I typically make it pretty tight and snug. And then to create that sort of vignette look is we just go and we just feather the crap out of it. And now we can lower the amount of the opacity to blend it in even more. And you can kind of incrementally pull it up to really accentuate that light. But now it looks, a little bit more vintagey than it did before. There you go.